Thank you for the introduction, and that actually gives me a good jumping off point, because the first thing I wanted to tell you a little bit about is who I am and why I'm here, and why I really care about this whole question of crafting our faith. Um, when I when I decided I wanted to study, I decided I came to university, I wanted to do law. That didn't work out. I ended up in political science. And I decided, like all other political scientists at the time, we had a concept of what political scientists do. So we knew Dr. Bell and Dr. Duncan, so we figured, well, become a lecturer at the university. And fortunately, I was fortunate enough to end up on the same stage teaching students politics for a little while. And then that came to an end. Along the way, however, I met a gentleman who was a pollster and a political researcher. He taught here as well. And he introduced me to this whole realm of polling. Situation came to a point where I had to leave the university and face the question as to what exactly do I do. And I thought of crafting a new area called political consulting for myself. It's not new to people who live in the United States and the UK, but certainly new to the Caribbean. The idea that someone could actually be a political scientist for a living and do nothing else, and that's ultimately what I have become, a bit of a craftsman, a little unusual, but an interesting job because it's one of the few things that you can do where you are not only abused in your country, but you're abused in all 14 Caribbean territories. And that is really the fascinating thing about this job, the fact that you are known, as the introducer just said, in some of the territories, and you're loved in some, and you're also hated in some, because we have a very clear idea of politics in the Caribbean. You're either on one side or the other, and if you're on the side that I am on, or if I'm on the side that you're on, I like you, and if you're on the other side, then you're talking foolishness and I hate you. So nonetheless, it's important, and this is one of the things which my predecessor, Patrick Emmanuel, said to me that I just want to share with you. And he said, as pollsters, we listen to ordinary people who would otherwise vote and take no part in democracy for another 5 years. And I think for me, that is a relatively solemn undertaking, because in between the 5-year period of voting, most people do not have any interaction with the system of democracy. They, however, talk to me. So in many of those countries, I encounter people who will bend my ear in the supermarket or when I'm standing in line or whatnot and say, I really feel you need to tell politicians this. I really feel you need to tell politicians that. And I think that that is, in a sense, a link that you provide to democracy, because otherwise these people would just vote and have no further part. So my objectives here today are really very simple. I'm just going to ask the question whether we see ourselves as craftsmen of our political fate, and if we don't, how can we become such craftsmen of our political fate? And I'm going to start with one of the, a takeaway from one of the relatively unusual surveys that I did for a newspaper entity. And you know, one of the challenges with polling in the Caribbean is that we don't do it like the Americans do. So we don't poll to find out things that are of interest. Invariably, the work that we do as an organization, well, let's say of interest, but you know, the work that we do as an organization is usually driven by a person's desire to win an election. So they call you in when they have a political need that has to be addressed, as opposed to, I'm just interested in knowing something. Turn of the century, the Nation newspaper was interested in knowing how Barbadians felt about themselves, how they felt about themselves and their political system at the turn of the century. It was a unique opportunity for me to ask people questions that had nothing to do with who they were voting for, but we just wanted to know how they feel about themselves. And that's the reason why I said it was interesting. And these were the results that we found, where we asked people what was the single most important disappointment that they faced in the last century. And this is what they told us. You can ignore all of the top bars and just look at the last two. People who were unable to complete their education, or they were unable to own a house or land, or repair their home, or something like that. I have found as I've moved across the region that those two things, education, home ownership, are the two most important things for people in Barbados. And guess what? I get the impression that there are also two very important things for people in the United Kingdom, United States, all across the world. I mean, we're all human beings, and we have the same, ultimately the same ontological desires. One of them is to be educated, and the other one is to have somewhere to live and have a roof over our head. These then would represent the two most significant demands on the political system that any one of us is likely to make. And certainly they would also represent the two most significant disappointments. So education for a lot of people is key, and when it doesn't work out, they are disappointed. And I think this should tell you a little bit about something that's likely to happen in the not too distant future. Let's move on. Have we improved? This is another question that we ask people. We ask them whether or not we have improved on two levels. On the personal level, have we improved on the national level? Now, bear in mind, I'm asking people, how have you and your family improved over the last 100 years? And most of the people I was speaking to only had a knowledge of the last 18 years or the last 50 years. But certainly we had nobody in there who was 100 years old, I could say, comparatively. But we're saying, just looking back and saying, how do you feel about yourself as a family and also as a nation in terms of the system and the improvement over the last 100 years? And what you're seeing here is essentially a reflection of the fact that people feel on a personal level they've improved. So my family is no more educated. My family is living in a better condition. However, on a national level, I do not believe that the country has necessarily improved, because if you look at the yellow bars, you're seeing that almost the same number of people have seen improvement and haven't seen improvement, which says a lot about where we are going or how we feel about ourselves. There's a disconnect. And I think in many ways this disconnect is reflected in the fact that we are not thoroughly convinced that our system is delivering all that we want it to deliver. Is the political system adequate? The other question that we ask, and against the background of the last set of information, it's reasonable then to ask, do we think the political system is adequate? And as appropriate, we ask that question. You can see here that the largest single set of respondents said that they thought the political system is adequate. But if you add the others, the ones who didn't know or who didn't answer, you get the impression that more people feel, or alternatively, more people can say positively that this political system is adequate, which is something in this business that raises questions. If you ask a set of people this question and the majority of them do not tell you yes, then clearly the problem is that the majority of people are not convinced that the political system is adequate. This is 57% in total, which is almost 60% of people in Barbados don't believe that the political system is adequate. And that tells us a lot about why people perhaps do not vote, because they don't believe that the system does a lot for them. When I stood on this stage, and in those days it was nice because there was a podium that I could rest my computer on. And I noticed that that's something that's not part of this format. Anyhow, I introduced my students to something called the systems model approach. This is a guy called David Easton, who a couple of you who are in here who were my students may be familiar with. But this is a basic systems model of the political system. And his argument was that the political system, which is in the middle, the process, relies on inputs and outputs, and it relies on feedback. And that's basically what I've been saying here today. It's the simplest model that I could introduce in an environment like this that tells you basically how the system is supposed to work. You make demands on a system, and as a result, you get results. So you want a house and education. The system, the process is supposed to give you a house and education, and if it doesn't work well, the feedback should tell you what is needed on the other side. It is a relatively straightforward way of understanding that we shape our own development. What it also tells me is that if our development is not consistent with what we want, whose fault is it? And that's the question that I'm going to respond to in the remaining minute. So I've outlined a three-step approach that I'm proposing that we take as a people in relation to solving this issue of our system not delivering. And the first one is to think. It's ironic that thinking is extremely rare in politics. Now you may think that you think, but the reality is that it is not a very popular thing. I had a professor in Trinidad and Tobago when I was studying who used to say to me, he said a lot of things that I dismissed, but one thing he said to me that was very true was that thinking is exhausting, and as a result of that, people don't tend to do it a lot. Right? In that same survey, sorry, not in that survey, one I did at the Barbados Community College around 1999 as well, which was a good year for these kinds of investigations. I asked the students at the community college, why did they vote in the way that they voted, right? And the vast majority of them told me that they voted the way they voted because that was what they were told to do. Or alternatively, they voted the way they voted because they thought that's what was expected of them. So if you have a situation in Barbados where the majority of people, and let's say take 100% of the voting population, 40% vote one way, 40% vote the other way, the government is changed by the remaining people in the middle, who neither vote one way or the other, or who swing from side to side, and that's what changes the government. Even in the two most extreme years, 1999 and 1986, where we had a huge swing, the election was determined based on 20% of the population because both parties still ended up with around 38 or 39 or 40% of the total popular vote, which means that the rest of people are not really thinking. They're just voting because that's who the family voted for, and they figure that that's what's expected of them, and they vote in the same way. This is a regional reality, and I think in a sense it's a global reality. In most two-party systems, that's the way it works. But we're concerned with this environment and the impact it has. If you're not thinking about your political decisions, then you can't expect anything out of it. When people know who you're going to vote for, and they know that they will get support from you, why would they bother to give you anything? We had a survey some time ago that was done by, I believe it was the Inter-American Development Bank, that identified St. John as the least developed constituency in Barbados. Does it surprise you? That is a place where you can reliably expect one political outcome. So there's really no reason for anyone to give anything to that group. Almost there. The second one is vote. Also straightforward. Barbados' population, voting population, there are around 250,000 people on the election roll. Last election, 150,000 people voted. So even though the election roll is inflated, you're still looking at something like 100,000 people who did not vote. That's ridiculous. People fought and died for the right to vote. People stood up in long lines in South Africa in 1990 to vote. We have the opportunity to go very easily and vote down the road. 100,000 people don't vote. And what are the reasons they give for voting? I didn't like the two choices. The reality is that somebody's going to win, one way or the other. And it is better that you have an option that you are less comfortable with than you give up the right to someone else to make that decision altogether and you relinquish your responsibility. And I realize I'm almost out of time. Thanks. Thanks. I realize I'm almost out of time, but I just wanted to make one very key point about the last election and the non-voting factor, right? There are 100,000 people that didn't vote, as I said. If you divide them per constituency, you're looking at something like, say, around 3,000 people in the 30 constituencies in Barbados that did not vote. There was only one instance where the election was determined by a margin that was in the vicinity of 3,000. So we could have had 29 different outcomes in the last election if all of those people have voted. That's a very, very serious point. We could have changed the outcome of the last election, not necessarily saying that you want to, because you may be very happy with it, and not suggesting that you shouldn't. But certainly the fact of the matter is that it is possible. So that's the reason why it's absolutely important that you should vote. And then the third one is accountability. We need to hold leaders accountable. Right? It's very, very difficult to do this in our system because our system is designed to let people vote and then leave and go away. And you're told repeatedly that there's really no basis on which people should get involved and so on. Remember years ago when George Bush was getting ready to go to the war and they had a protest. A few thousand people turned out to the streets of Washington to protest. He said that 3,000 people in a voting population of 300 million is like a focus group. The fact is that I didn't really send a strong signal. Here in Barbados, we have to ask ourselves, what are the mechanisms that we can use to hold politicians accountable? Accountable for telling lies, accountable for talking foolishness, accountable for creating offense. We need to hold them accountable on both sides. for all of these things. And I think the culture has to change. And I mean, we don't have facilities where we can recall people and whatnot, but we have to think of how can we use the media to create accountability. How can we use social media and social media activism to create accountability? How can we use public demonstrations if necessary to create a level of accountability? Trade unions, how can we use them? And as I say, public accountability and the marching, bear in mind that were it not for public demonstrations, it is entirely possible that we could have the Cahill project proceeding. I tend to think public reaction had a lot to do with the reason why that project is no longer proceeding. Okay. We sent a signal in relation to the solid waste tax as a people, and that has also been scrapped. So as much as you think that the focus groups, as George Bush called them, are things that politicians ignore, I actually do think that they take note. And they may take note yet again, who knows. Then we have trade unions and NGOs, and we heard from a few NGO people today that have to help create an environment of accountability. So ladies and gentlemen, there is really no magic bullet. There's really no magic bullet, but what there is a process, and I have outlined a 3-step approach that, in my opinion, can give us some idea of how we can start the process of becoming craftsmen of our political faith. And I want to thank you very much.